Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, whether in person or online. Mr. Bill Morris is here to talk about his great new book, Lions Finally Roar. Mr. Joe LaPointe will be his conversation partner. Bill Morris is the author of novels Motor City and Motor City Burning, along with the family memoir, The Age of Astonishment. He is currently a staff writer with the online literary magazine, The Millions, and his writing has appeared in Granta, the New York Times, the Washington Post magazine, LA Weekly, Popular Mechanics, and numerous other newspapers and magazines. Mr. Joe LaPointe, I remember him from his column, his works in the Detroit Free Press and News. He has also been a reporter with the New York Times. Currently, he's a freelance writer, and he often has, I've seen that he has a column in Metro Times. So please welcome Mr. Bill Morris and Mr. Joe LaPointe.
So what do you want to do, Joe?
Listen to questions. Tell them about your book, why you wrote it, and your good timing.
Yeah, well, the timing was dumb luck completely. I started writing the book. Well, I should go back and tell you a little personal history. My father went to work at Ford Motor Company in 1952, right after I was born. He was a newspaper reporter in Washington at the Post. And Ford was beefing up their PR staff for the 50th anniversary in 1953. So my father, doubled his pay, and he, Catholic family, he said, yeah, let's do this. So we moved to Detroit when I was in diapers. And a few years later, he wound up working for William Clay Ford Sr. as his personal, Bill Ford said, my PR guy. And like my boy Friday, his bag carrier, he was his executive assistant. And so for about 10 years, from the mid-50s to the mid-60s, my father and Bill Ford saw each other every day. They traveled all over the world together, to Europe and California, and when the Continental Mark II came out, that beautiful car, that there's a picture of it in the book, my father ran the publicity campaign. It was a nationwide thing. They had a train with a bunch of cars on it. They went to Dallas and Atlanta and LA and San Francisco. And so my father and Bill Ford got to be quite close. Big drinking guys, both of them. And later in his life, after my father had retired, I sat down with him for about 3 or 4 days with a tape recorder and asked him, tell me your life story. And a lot of that story was about his years at Ford. And then 25 years after that, along about 2021, I guess, I'd been following the Lions from afar, just kind of aware of what they were doing, and realized that they were almost always a terrible team. And the people in Detroit were suffering year after year after year, and yet remaining loyal. So that to answer your question, Joe, I started thinking after Sheila Hamp took over the team in 2020, fired the general manager and coach, and then brought in this highly vaunted guy, Brad Holmes, and Dan Campbell, who you all know, I'm sure. And they lose their first 10 games, and then they win a few. And then the next season, they lose 5 out of their first 6. And that's really when I started thinking, there's a book here, because it's about corporate cultures, really. I mean, how can an organization be so consistently bad? They had some good years, and they made the playoffs a few times, but under Bill Ford, they won exactly 1 playoff game in 50 years, which is not much of a record. So I started thinking, I'm going to write a book about the futility of this culture, this team, and the ownership and the management, and that's where the book got started.
I thought right there alone, that's a pretty good book, because up until that point, Lions fans had learned to almost celebrate their misery.
Yeah.
I'm born and raised in Detroit. I remember when they played at Briggs Stadium.
Me too.
And I remember some of the turbulence that has gone on. So I said to Bill, yeah, you got a good regional book. The Lion fans will like to retell the same old stories to each other. Alex Karras, Dick the Bruiser. There's all kinds of Lion stories. they've been here almost as long as the Ford Motor Company. Ford was 1903, the Lions got here in what, 38?
34.
34, yeah, 34. So they kind of grew, these two stories are intertwined together, the Ford family and the Detroit Lions. People forget that Sheila is the fourth Ford family member to run the team, and the transitions have not always been smooth.
So, but then, like, as you know, I started writing the book, and I'll tell you, my original working title was Natural Born Losers. And I was gonna write a story about failure, and I thought, this will be great, you know, because America loves success stories. I'm gonna go against the grain and write a book about a failure story. Well, then I'm nearing the end of the book, and that at that point, after that 1-5 start, they started winning in the middle of the 2022 season, and then the 2023 season, you know, you all know what happened there. So I had a completely different ending to my book. The history was the same, but the last couple of 3 years, I had to make that up, and not make it up. I had to write it on the fly because things were changing so fast. And like you said, good timing. It was just dumb luck that they had that fabulous season last year, almost went to the Super Bowl. And that was when I finished writing the book. Right after that, I finished in February. So I had the book just about written, and I was waiting to see what happened in that game. You know, if they'd have gone to their first Super Bowl, that would have been another ending. But so that was dumb luck on my part, because I think it makes a much happier story. You know, I thought failure would be great, but I think people would rather read about.
What a great week to launch a book. They're on the cover of Sports Illustrated.
Yeah.
Everyone's talking about them. Are you guys all lifetime Lions fans?
Yep.
Everybody.
Is anybody thinking that this might be a season of less than Super Bowl, maybe some disappointment? No. This is an optimistic group.
Oh, yeah, I read a story in the paper today about the optimism level of the fans.
I've never seen it quite like this. At the end of last season, I've seen Detroit fans happy, I've seen them angry, but I've never seen them astonished the way they were last season. People's jaws were just dropping around town. People were starting conversations with strangers just because you happen to be wearing the right shirt. It was really something.
Yeah. Well, does anybody have questions about the book or the Lions? Or are they going to go to the Super Bowl? Yes or no?
I was thinking, yeah.
You think they are?
That's what Sports Illustrated is predicting, and that we'll even win it.
Yeah,
I'm cautiously optimistic. I hope.
Yeah.
It's been my goal. I've been a fan since '91. I've hoped since I started playing football, you know, no pads or anything in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And I've hoped since then, since I followed them, since their last winning a playoff game in '91,
Right.
that they would make it before I die. And I'm 53 now. So I'm hoping this year will be the year.
Got a few years left in you.
Yeah, I hope you stay alive. Win or lose.
Considering it was 57 was the last time when the Super Bowl didn't exist at that point.
Yeah.
That's one of the things I like about the book is it opens up with Bill Ford not owning the Lions yet, but he's in the third deck at Briggs Stadium looking down on the championship game field. And it puts him, and then it builds from there until he eventually takes over the team in 1963.
Yeah. Yeah, those were crazy games. Yes, sir.
Why do you think Bill Ford was not successful as the owner of the Lions? Just all these years.
Yeah, I don't, you know, that's a complicated thing. I personally think a lot of the answer lies in his upbringing and background, and even his relationship to his brother, Henry II, his big brother. Henry is the first of 4 children. Bill was the last. And I'm a kid brother myself, and I know about this dynamic of, you know, what goes on between brothers. And they did not get along well. When Henry killed the Continental Mark II, which was Bill's dream car, beautiful car, the one that my dad worked on, after 2 years, Bill Ford, I got quotes from him saying that's when he started drinking really heavily. And that's also when he bought into the syndicate. As Joe said, it was 144 owners, and he had never really had to work in his life. He never had to prove or do anything. Henry ran the Ford Motor Company, and it was very apparent that there was only room for one Ford at Ford. always has been the case between old Henry and Edsel. It was the same story. But this is within the same generation. So Bill was sort of, he never had to perform. I mean, he had enough money. If the Lions didn't win, it didn't hurt him. And he never had any success in business or in sports, obviously. And I think that you might disagree with this, but I think he took he dealt with it as a fan, not as a businessman. And the successful team owners are hardcore guys and women who, are in it to win, and they'll do anything. Bill Ford, as in the case with my father, he liked to surround himself with people who made him comfortable, who didn't want something from it, who weren't out for a raise or a job offer or a connection or something like that. And so he wound up surrounding himself with people who made him feel comfortable, who were not very often good at what they did. Russ Thomas is a classic example of that. 22 years, he's the general manager because Ford liked him. That's another $1 million question. What was the relationship between those two guys, which I've never quite gotten to the bottom of. And then, Chuck Schmidt for 12 years as the general manager. And then most disastrously, Matt Millen so he's hiring bad people and staying with them way too long because he's not a real businessman. And I think that's what created the culture of losing. And, the players, I talked to Joe Schmidt, my cousin John Morris played center for the team from 75 to 77 when they opened the Silver Dome. And they all, Sam Williams, that tape the interview you did with Sam Williams, I just love Billy Ford. The players love the guy. They love the Ford family. The Ford family really wanted the team to win. They truly care about the team. Always have, from the day Bill bought it. But that doesn't translate into winning games, and the year before Bill died, a guy in Sports Illustrated wrote, people who know Bill Ford love him, and people who don't know him, which is to say most Lions fans, hate him. And that was the sort of dynamic of the man's life. My father he worshiped the guy. I mean, he said he was just a funny, fun, charming, classy guy. And people, but that doesn't translate into success in business, obviously. And I think that's I don't know if I answered your question, but I think that's where it came from, that inability to make the hard decisions and then stick with them, which is what Sheila has done. I think that's the big difference between those two.
Loyalty, you talked about loyalty in the book.
Yeah.
How do you think that played in with Bill Ford?
Well, loyalty is a funny thing. It can be great and it can be debilitating, right? And I think in his case, he had the misfortune of being loyal to the wrong people. I mean, and now let's compare that to Sheila. There was sort of the pivotal moment in the book, in my narrative of the story, was that second season under Campbell and Holmes, when they went 1-5. And I don't know, you may have seen this, it was in the Free Press. She went to the practice facility in Allen Park in the middle of the week after they were 1-5. And the reporters all saw her and they run up to her because she's never out there. And they get their microphones out and they're surrounding her. And she says, she just went into this impromptu monologue about, are the fans upset and depressed? Yes. Am I upset and depressed? Yes. But we're doing this the right way. We're building it from the draft, which is exactly what they did. And I believe we have the right people in place. I believe in our players, and I'm sticking with these guys. So just please be patient. And they lost the next game, and then they won 3 or 4 in a row and beat the Packers and almost made it into the playoffs. And that was the moment, because she was loyal to the right people, whereas her father had been loyal to the wrong people again.
And she's the 4th Ford family member to run the team. I was covering the New York Giants for the New York Times when transition was made between young Bill Ford and his mother. And John Mara, the owner of the Giants, said to me, all these years, young Bill Ford's been coming to the meetings, the N.F.L. meetings representing the Lions, and now Martha Ford's there. What's going on? And I said, I don't know, but there's something going on. there aren't many female owners of sports teams. And Mrs. Ford was one of them, and now Sheila Happ is one of them. She may be one of the most successful female sports teams owners. It's a new era.
You know, I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, it was the first time in the NFL history that a female owner passed ownership to another female.
That sounds right.
I think that's a fact, and that's, you know, but to go back to Sheila, I think that the thing that distinguished her and the reason that she's successful, she said, I believe in these guys. I believe in the system that we got going here. I believe in our players. And then I took that to mean, and I write this in the book, that the reason for that is because she believes in herself. She has the confidence and the poise and the iron in her to believe that she's doing the right thing. And I don't think her father ever really had that. I don't, you know, he changed coaches and managers and whichever way the wind blew, and, you know, if you don't make the playoffs, off with your head, and, you know, if you don't win on Sunday, you're fired, you know, that kind of stuff. And there was no way to run a team, because I don't think he believed in himself in a very deep way. And that's, you know, I don't know that. I'm not a psychologist, but I do believe that Sheila believes in herself. And I think that that's really what turned that team around.
She was in the first female class at Yale.
Yeah, yeah. Her father's alma mater. And so she came up in the feminist era, you know, and she was a very strong-willed woman and wanted to get into Ford Motor Company, that wanted to get into the Lions, and was blocked in both pursuits because they're man's worlds. Ford Motor Company less so now, and the Lions obviously less so with Martha, when Martha took over. But yeah, and I think that, you know, the generation when she came along, and she was a real sort of groundbreaker, you know, first female class at Yale. That's pretty radical. And, you know, she was a strong woman. There's Bill McGraw. Yes, sir. I know, a Dearborn resident. Any other questions? Anybody, any thoughts? Yes.
Eli Zarek said, this is the best book he's read of the Detroit sports franchise. And I wanted to ask Joe, are you surprised here 61 years after Bill Ford bought the Lions, that this is the first real book to address the ownership of that, you know, the history of the team in that length of time? I mean, Richard Bach did a great book about the Lions of the 50s, but I mean, if you really look at the franchise and what happened in getting into the business angle of it and so forth, are you surprised that it took this long?
No, not really. The Fords are the royal family of our region. And I don't think people wanted to be too harsh and write, at least locally, and write books like that. I think Bill is the ideal author. He not only had an insight, but he's been away from Detroit long enough to see it in perspective.
Yeah.
I think there will be more books about the Lions, and I'd love to read a biography of Sheila.
Yeah.
She doesn't do interviews. She wouldn't talk to you.
She wouldn't talk to me, and neither would Martha or Bill. But in fact, one of the chapters in the book is called Private People, which is what the Fords are. And that's their business. That's free country. So, but I agree, Sheila would make a great story. I mean, just a biography would be cool. I'm sorry, did somebody else have a question over here?
Well, you're kind of touching on it. So what were your sources and which ones were the most valuable?
I'm sorry, what were my what?
What were your sources, your research sources?
Well, there was a lot. Bill Dow over here, the good-looking guy with the Swiss suntan on him, he is a freelance historian of Detroit sports who knows more about it than any of us ever will. He interviewed a bunch of Lions after they'd retired and generously shared those cassette tapes with me. I had to go out and buy a cassette tape player to listen to them. And they had some wonderful quotes in there. I'm thinking about Sam Williams in particular. So there was that. I talked to a lot of people personally, including Joe Schmidt, Matt Millen, you know, dozens. It's all listed. The interviews are all listed in the back of the book. The Benson Ford Library has a fabulous trove of tape recorded interviews called The History of Automotive Styling, I think it's called. And in there, Bill Ford was interviewed, and I got a transcript of that. It was like a 56-page interview where he talks about taking his little speedster out on the urban test track when his parents were out of town, and the throttle gets stuck and he's doing 100 miles an hour. And, you know, stories like that you can't make up. And I got a hold of that just because I pestered them to send me the transcript, because they haven't digitized a lot of those interviews. Some they have. Gene Bourdonnais, a great stylist at Ford for 20 years. My father knew him quite well. His tapes were transcribed. So these were deep, these were like, 20, 30, 40 page interviews where these guys talked about the nuts and bolts of car design and styling and business decisions and stuff like that. So there was that. You mentioned Richard Back. He wrote a couple of great books about Edsel and Henry, and also about the Lions in the 50s. There's a fairly sizable literature about football, and of course about the Ford Motor Company and the Ford family. So there was a lot there. And another thing I shouldn't forget, a guy who was very helpful to me was named Bill Keenest. I don't know if any of you know him. He was the Lions communications guy for 20 years. And his successor is a young guy named Eamon Reynolds. And I approached Eamon, and he put me in touch with Bill, and Bill Keenest talked to me a dozen times probably on the phone. And he knew stuff like, he knew how close Kevin Glover and Barry Sanders and Lomas Brown were. And he told me stories about how they socialized, and they had him over cooking dinner and stuff, stuff you couldn't find in the newspaper anywhere. And that was just, institutional memory on Bill's part. And Eamon says to me, and you know about this archive, I think you might have told me about it.
Yeah.
The Lions have an extensive clip file, like the scrapbooks, like, they clipped out newspaper articles. Well, Bill Keenest, that was his baby, and they recently digitized it. And Eamon says, I'll send you the links. And it was like, 50 files full of, media guides, training camp every year back into the 50s. Even, I think it was even in the 40s. And so not a lot of that interested me. I was more interested in 57 onward. But I spent months combing through these Joe Falls columns and Joe LaPointe columns, and it was fascinating stuff, because then you start to connect dots. You say, that's right, they traded him here, and then he went there, and then you start to see the narrative. You see a story comes out, but you have to. It's like with tweezers, you have to dig and dig and dig, and fortunately, I was lucky. Like I say, there's a sizable trove of stuff out there, and I'm an old newspaper man.
It's not one particular source, but it's just
I'm sorry, I can hardly hear you.
what's one particular source, but the collective of narratives in the city, anecdotal stuff, right? Not one book or anything in particular.
No, I can't think of anything. Bill Keenest he was invaluable to me.
So it's kind of who you got you in the doors for the research.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to say. I don't have a favorite color, and I couldn't pick out a person who.
Like red, great cat.
So, I hope I answered your question. I mean, there was a.
Aside of the question, reference the drinking culture, which is part of the times. But I wonder, in your perception of the boards, do you think that there was addiction issues?
I'm sorry.
Was there addiction issues?
Drinking, is it just social or?
Oh no, Bill Ford was a full-blown alcoholic, and I have a quote in there that he admitted that he started drinking after his brother killed the Continental Mark II. And that's when he hit the bottle, and he started drinking really heavily. And everybody's, I remember his face, he got bloated and his eyes were glassy, and he stopped at our house from time to time. So I would see him, and I could tell there was something wrong with me even as a kid. Well, his eldest daughter, Muffy, I can't remember her real name, Elizabeth maybe, Is it Martha? Yeah, that's right. And they call her Muffy.
Yeah.
She was at a girls' prep school in Connecticut. I think it was 1965. They were getting ready to play the Colts, I think, on Thanksgiving Day. She comes home from Connecticut, takes one look at her father and says, "My God," she says, "Daddy, I'm not going back to school. I'm staying here until we get you fixed up." And he said, "Well, if I wanted to wreck myself, I figured that was my business. My wife never said anything about the drinking." And I figured if I'm not hurting anybody, I can kill myself if I want to. But when my daughter comes to me and says, you know, you're killing me here. I can't stand to see you like this. He woke up and said, you know, alcoholics live in a kind of a bubble of their own. And that popped the bubble. He said, I've got to do something about this. And boom, he went to Donwood Clinic in Toronto, checked himself in. And, you know, they gave him antabuse and 28-day dry out cold turkey, which has to be hell. I mean, he'd been drinking heavily for 10 years every day. And he never took another drink from what everybody I've talked to. So yes, there was addiction there. Big brother Henry, on the other hand, was a big drinker too. They all were big drinkers, but he claimed he didn't get hangovers. You know, he would pound down the scotch and the Pomard wine. My father said he was always first one in the office in the morning, clean shaven, crisp suit, ready to go. He didn't get hangovers. So, you know, they had different body chemistry, obviously, but they both were big, heavy drinkers. My father was too. My father wound up in AA. And, you know, but, you know, it's like watching the episodes of Mad Men where everybody's constantly smoking and drinking. I mean, it was, you know, that was really the culture.
The best part of the book is this, when he gets into, Bill is very descriptive about William Clay Ford's problems. There's also an undertone of sympathy and empathy, and I think it comes out very well.
Thank you. That's nice to hear. You know, it's like I was saying earlier, everybody liked Bill Ford who knew him. He was universally a popular man. I mean, he had a lot of virtues. And yeah, I mean, just because he was a failure at what he did doesn't mean he's a bad person. I don't know if that's not a fair thing to say, but I don't know. Yes, sir.
How do the Fords feel about your book?
I have no idea, but I'm willing to bet they're not happy.
I mean, because there are skeletons that are coming out that they're not going to be happy about, but
Right.
it's people's lives. This is
Yeah.
what.
Well, and a lot of the stuff is public record. I mean, it's out there. I didn't make it up.
He brought it together.
Yeah, I brought it together, and you know, that story I was just telling about Bill's daughter saying, "I'm not going back to school until we get you fixed." That was in a book. I mean, that Bill Ford gave that interview to another writer, and I attribute it to the writer, and I have footnotes, and there's extensive notes at the end of the book about where this stuff comes from, and yeah, so but they didn't want to talk to me, which I understand. I get that,
Right.
and but I think the facts are facts, and it's all there.
Well, they're in the public limelight, so
Yeah,
like it or not, it's gonna come out sooner,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
everything does.
Yeah, the
absolutely.
public,
Especially in this world today, because of the digital footprint,
yes,
you can't do anything without somebody catching you.
That's right. And there's also good stuff in the book. They had wonderful players. Sheila is a success story at the end. It ends on a very upbeat note, not because I chose to do that. It's just, that's the story. I mean, it is upbeat. I mean, look at what's going on in the city right now. It's almost crazy. So there's good and bad, but I don't know their reaction to it. I sent a copy to the guy I mentioned, Eamon Reynolds, the communications guy. He thanked me for the book, and he hasn't said a word about it. So I don't, I would think that if he loved it, he might have said something. So,
there's a lot about Bobby Lane and Night Train Lane.
yeah, that's right.
Also,
And Joe Schmidt.
Some good Joe Schmidt stuff.
Yeah.
A lot of anecdotes, it'll be familiar to a lot of you. You'll remember, I read that in the 1970s, yeah.
Yeah.
But for people who don't live around here, some of it will be a revelation.
I hope.
Russ Thomas, did you talk to him during the career? What was he like? I mean, yeah, Joe, probably Joe.
Very stubborn,
Yeah, I mean,
stuck to his guns.
yeah, how he could do that for so long a time.
I think Bill was saying it's a friendship with William Clay Ford that wasn't going to be. Well, eventually they did part though, didn't they?
Well, he made him retire at 65, and he didn't want to go.
Oh.
He went kicking and screaming into retirement, died less than a year later. But he was, I never talked to the man. You covered him, didn't you?
Russ, yeah.
Yeah.
He was I was doing a lot of television sports coverage, and he used to they had the biggest stadium in the NFL at the time at the Silverdome. And they'd sell 75,000 tickets and black out the game.
That was the stupidest thing. No, seriously, I mean, think about that. You build an 80,000 seat stadium, you sell 70,000 tickets, you have to have a sellout in order to black out a game. That's the league's rules, I believe.
Or some stadiums, 55,000 was a sellout in a bigger market. So it didn't really make much sense, but I wasn't gonna convince Russ of any other way to go.
Yeah. Oh, man, that's crazy. That's like cutting off your nose to spite your face, right?
Jerry Green did a lot of good stuff on Russ Thomas. He was very perceptive. And Falls had some of his better columns in that era.
Joe Falls.
Yeah, Joe Falls.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he also had a empathy and affection for Russ in some way, maybe not at your level.
Yeah,
I mean, from Mr. Ford
yeah.
at your level.
Well, I remember some things Joe Falls wrote, that I actually quote in the book where they'd suffered some horrible Thanksgiving Day loss. And he finds Bill Ford in the locker room, brooding in the corner.
Yeah,
And he wrote about how, a lot of people in this town think this is just a poor little rich boy who's, playing with his big expensive toy, his football team. And Joe Falls came down and saying, he dies inside every time they lose. He really cares about this team. The people whose paycheck he's signing ought to care half as much as he did. They'd be a good team. That kind of stuff. Where Falls was very sympathetic to Ford and sort of laudatory almost.
yeah, I thought he understood him.
Yeah.
And I thought Jerry Green did too, and it was a good era for football writing. Jerry Green started out on the Lions beat at the Detroit News, and then became a columnist, and he was pretty well wired into that franchise.
Yeah, he was a hell of a guy. Another great writer whose writing I loved was Pete Waldmeyer.
Yeah,
He said, what did he say? Tiger Stadium is like John Barrymore with a 3-day beard and mustard on his tie. That's sort of a little down in the mouth, and back when Tiger Stadium was crumbling a little bit. Right?
did anybody ever see them at U of D when they played at U of D? No, nobody would have.
Exhibition game.
Did they? Oh, they played
Blue, silver, inter squad.
inter squad.
What was that? Was that called Dinan Stadium?
Yeah.
Yeah. I got a picture of the 1934 game against the Packers.
How long did they play there?
3 years, I think.
Joe, that was it.
Yeah, 3 or 4. They won the championship in 35.
38 was their first time in Great Stadium.
Yeah, okay, so there were 34, 5, 6, and 7, 4 years at U of D. And then they went to Briggs Stadium. Yes, sir.
Was it a surprise I was surprised when Bill Ford did not become the person in charge of the Lions after his father died.
Bill Jr.
Bill Jr., right? Was that a surprise? And
Yes.
What's the speculation about why that happened? Why did Sheila get the team? And it was, in a sense, taken away from Bill because he kind of ran it in his dad's later years.
What do you want to run with that one?
We were talking earlier about the owner of the Giants came to me when I was in New York and said, all of a sudden, Mrs. Ford is showing up at the NFL meetings. What's going on?
You're talking about Martha.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
Mrs. Ford Senior. And it was a surprise to all the NFL owners that this relatively senior citizen had all of a sudden taken over from her younger heir apparent son. I don't think anybody's ever gotten to the bottom of why it happened. Ford family transitions of power are not always smooth.
There was I quote this book, you may remember it, American Icon, Bryce Hoffman. He was a business writer for the Free Press. It was about when Bill Ford Jr. brought Alan Mulally from Boeing to run Ford, when Bill Ford Jr. was just, the stock price was going in half, and he realized he was out of his depth. And I think that he writes about the sibling rivalry between Bill Jr. and Sheila. And Sheila was really wanted to get into the organization. And she and Bill were butting heads on a lot of stuff about how he was running the Ford Motor Company, including he hired Sheila's husband, Steve Hamp, as his, what was the word, executive assistant, his number one guy. Well, Mullally comes in and takes the job and says, I don't want this guy between me and my top lieutenants. I want them to walk in the door and talk directly to me. I don't want this filter of this guy, this, whoever he is, Steve
Yeah,
Ham.
Steve Ham.
And Bill Ford Jr. is like, oh, man, you know, he wants me to get rid of my brother-in-law. And he resisted and resisted, and Mullally said, look, I'm not gonna come to take the job if you don't get rid of this guy. So he goes to Steve Ham and says, Steve, you gotta go. Well, I don't think that went over well with Steve or Sheila, from what the Hoffman reported in his book. And, you know, there's another sibling thing, you know, it was Henry and Bill, and now it's Sheila and Bill Jr., and they're butting heads. And I've heard other things about Martha was not happy with Bill Jr. for business reasons and maybe family, you know, marital reasons, whatever. That's all speculation. But I think a lot of people were surprised when Sheila got the keys to the car from Mom instead of Bill Jr.
Quit that.
Yeah. Drove it off into the sunset. Yes, sir.
I'm surprised the writer, maybe a writer's asked Bill Ford, like, what do you think of the job your sister's doing? What do you think of the Lions? I mean, I've never seen him at the state, I mean, on television anyway, I used to see on the executive suites. I wonder if he's even showing up at games.
Yeah, I don't think he is. I heard he's not welcome, but you know, I think that when he got bypassed for that, I think he just kind of said, I'm out, you know, I'm gone. And they really look at the Michigan Central train station. I mean, he's doing good stuff.
Yeah.
He hasn't disappeared from the world, but I think that he realized that his future was not with the Lions, and he might as well go on with his life. And that's just, again, that's speculation, but it seems to make sense to me. I mean, but I don't know what you just said, that, you know, nobody's ever approached him. I don't live in Detroit, so I wouldn't see that kind of thing. I read the Free Press every day, but I haven't seen it either, Bill. I mean,
Neither have they.
yeah, I don't think anybody has, because it doesn't exist. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Who hired Matt Patricia?
I'm sorry, who hired who?
Who hired Matt Patricia?
That was Martha. She hired Bob Quinn as her GM when she took over the team in 2020. And then, no, I'm sorry, 2014, after Bill died. She hires Quinn. What happened was she went to the N.F.L. They have a committee of consultants who they will farm out to teams when they need help finding front office people. And they sent Ernie Accorsi to Detroit. And Ernie Accorsi had done a lot of general manager consulting around the league, was very highly regarded. Dave Burkett wrote about him, saying this is a great, great move to bring Ernie Accorsi in for this GM search. Well, she took his advice and hired Bob Quinn. Then Bob Quinn wants to bring the Patriot way from New England to Detroit, talks her into hiring Matt Patricia. She hires Matt Patricia. And we all know what happened there. It was a disaster. And then Sheila, this was when Sheila was actually in the ascendancy. And I don't think people realized it at the time. In hindsight, I can see it very clearly. Martha gets Sheila to go meet the press in 2019. I'm not sure the date, 2019, and said, you know, she sits down with the reporters. It was the first time Sheila was front and center stage. And she says, look, I know everybody's calling for these guys' heads. We're gonna stick with them. We're gonna give them one more year, and it's playoffs or bust. We're gonna stick with these guys for another year. And then she wound up firing them because, you know, they failed. But that was when she kind of took charge of the thing. And I think it was, you know, that's what turned the team around, really, was getting rid of these guys. That was a terrible situation. And she had the good sense to say, you know, importing the Patriot way is not the way to run a football team. I mean, I think that's obvious, right? She says, we're gonna make a Detroit team. And that means, you know, all that great stuff Dan Campbell said, you know, they're gonna kick us, knock us down, we're gonna bite off their kneecaps. Dan Campbell played, you know, he was the tight end for the Lions in that winless 0-16 season in, what was it, 2008. That was his last season playing. he understands Detroit. He understands what the fans have been through. And that's the kind of guy she wanted to get. And Chris Spielman, a great linebacker, you may remember, she brought him in before to help the search for those guys. And I think Spielman was a very critical player in that whole assembly of the organization and the success. So did that answer your question? You're asking about Matt Patricia. I got it.
You did.
Yeah, okay. All right. I sometimes my brain goes off and I don't know where I
He
am.
was a loser.
Huh?
He was a loser. And why they kept him, I don't know.
You're talking about Patricia.
Right.
Yeah. Well, do you remember when, before he even coached his first game, I think it was the Free Press, broke the story that he had been charged with raping a girl in a Texas beach when he was in college at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Well, I remember reading that story and I'm going, my God, the Lions, this is part of my original statement. I'm following the Lions from afar and I'm like reading this. My God, they hire a coach and they don't even know that he's been charged with rape. You know, what kind of vetting process went on there? And, you know, Patricia, of course, is outraged that people are dragging up this ancient incident. Well, you know what? You were charged and the girl balked at testifying in open court and the charges were dropped. Was he innocent? I don't know. Nobody knows. But you certainly should have known that before you offered the guy a job, right? And they didn't even, that was, I put that on Martha because they didn't do that. So, and the players did not like the guys, from what I can tell.
I wasn't around that team.
Yeah, you weren't hooked up. But everything I read there, you know, he was a real authoritarian. He was trying to prove himself and you know, establish his macho-ness. It didn't work with these guys. Yeah, he was a bad, one of many bad hires.
Oh, yeah.
I was at Tiger Stadium the day that you guys might remember this one. Harry Gilmer's last game as head coach. Anybody?
Yeah.
He wore a Stetson hat. He was a quarterback out of Alabama, and they lost to the lowly Vikings and were dragged into a last place tie on the last day of the season. It was Harry Gilmer's second season. Gilmer was the first coach that Bill Ford Sr. hired. He got rid of George Wilson, who had won the championship in '57, because he wanted to have his own organization. As an aside, he also offered my father the general manager's job before he hired Russ Thomas. My father knew nothing about football, which proves my point about Bill Ford wanting to surround himself with people he liked rather than people who knew what they were doing. But I digress. Where was I, Joe? Yeah.
Henry Gilman.
Oh yeah, Gilbert. So he's walking off the field and the fans are singing, "Goodbye, Harry, we hate to see you go." I look out of the corner of my eye, I was in the upper deck, and I see a little white arc, snowball. It was December. 2 more. Suddenly, a barrage of snowballs is coming down from the upper deck. The Lions players are holding up their parkas to protect the coach. And the Free Press had a picture of a snowball hit his Stetson and knocked it askew on his head. Right, the photographer got the shot right when the snowball hit. And I thought, wow, that picture is worth 1 billion words because it tells you everything you need to know about how Detroit feels about Harry Gilmer. And I was there, I watched that. I was too far away to hit him, but if I had a chance, I definitely would have gone for that. But that was Harry Gilmer's last day, and everybody knew he was gone after that game. And he was canned after 2 years. And that was the first of countless numbers of bad hires that Bill Ford did. That was really the beginning of the end, I think. Yeah, sad.
I was gonna say, it's pretty amazing, but George Wilson was the last Detroit Lion head coach to ever get another head coaching job after coaching the Lions.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he was the first head coach.
Where'd he go?
Miami Dolphins in 1967. There's never been a head coach of the Lions who ever got another head coaching job.
Yeah, it was a death sentence. Yeah, it was a death sentence. And a lot of these coaches move around to dozens of teams, right?
Right.
And yeah, that tells you something right there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's sad.
I believe Bill Belichick was a coach for the Lions. Chuck Knox, who you talk about for getting a book.
Yeah.
About how.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
They let him get away.
Quality.
Don Shula,
Yeah, Don Shula.
Bill Belichick, all these guys were with the Lions organization. They all got away. They got rid of Garo Yepremian, the funny pot-bellied soccer style kicker. And he wound up winning the Super Bowl with Miami with Don Shula, former Lions. And, you know, it's a classic, you know, he's hanging on to the wrong people and letting the right people get away again and again and again, coaches and players. And there's something there. That's not an accident. If it happens 2 or 3 times, okay. But if it happens year after year after year after year, that's not an accident, right? And yet, look at, you guys are all optimistic and you're still with the Lions. And I tell you, I dedicate the book, it's for the people of Detroit who survive everything America can dish out. And that's a quote from Philip Levine, the great poet from blue collar Detroit. You know, Detroiters survive everything America can dish out, and they remained loyal to this team through the thinnest years. I have immense admiration, not just for the people of Detroit, but for Lions fans. I mean, you know, to stick with this crazy organization for so long, it's really kind of beautiful. It's interesting to me.
I think it's just a drum of Detroit fans. I mean, we love the music, we love all our sports teams.
Yeah.
We just embrace them, even if we never win.
Yeah. Well, you know, I'm glad you said that about music and stuff, because when I started writing the book, I was hoping to write a book. I didn't want to write a football book. I wanted to write a Detroit book about the history and the you know, the culture, the music, the art, the Edsel, the Diego Rivera, the Continental Mark II, the MC5, Motown, all the fascinating stuff that's
It
happened.
all plays together, really, when you think about it.
Yeah, it's the most amazing city I've ever been in my life. I mean, it's really a fascinating place. And you know, to tell it through the lens of the football team, that's an okay way to go. I think that was a pretty good idea when I look back on it. I'm not bragging, I'm just saying it was it was fun to write the book. I learned a lot and I enjoyed it too.
Most cities don't have 4 bedrock franchises in the big sports. This is one of the few. The Lions have been around since there were 12 teams.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, there's a lot of curses in sports, Chicago Cubs and with the Lions and Bobby Lane.
The Red Sox.
And Red Sox, yep. Bobby Lane. Do you think the curse is lifted?
I don't know. We're going to find out real soon, right? That's interesting. You know, Bill Ford, he bought the team. The sale was approved by his fellow 143 shareholders of the syndicate that owned the team. The sale was approved on November 22nd, 1963. And they were at the Book Cadillac Hotel. And my father tells me that, you know, they went in to have lunch and to celebrate the consummation of the sale. And the waitress comes up and says, "Gentlemen, have you heard the news about President Kennedy?" And they're all like, and Bill Ford's like, "Oh God, here he's waiting for a punchline," because people were making a lot of jokes about John Kennedy. His approval ratings were going down like this. He started out at 87%, he hit 53%, and that's why he was out in Dallas touring the country trying to. And Bill Ford's thinking, "Oh God, here comes another poor little rich boy joke," which is not his favorite type of joke. And she says, "The president was shot dead in Dallas." And Bill Ford said years later, you had to think that there was some sort of stigma attached to anything that happened on that horrible day. And that was his take on it. You know, a lot of people, the curse of Bobby Lane, the stigma of the Kennedy assassination. You know, I don't know about all that stuff, but if it was true, this is going to be the year to exercise that if it's going to happen, right?
Yeah, hopefully.
So, anybody else? I guess we're set.
Okay,
No chat questions, so I think we're good there.
okay. Sure, anybody else have something that they'd like to ask? Okay, well, I want to say thank you very much for Mr. Morris and Mr. Point for coming out and talking about Mr. Morris's book. It's a great book. He has some copies available for purchase here.
Yes,
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
I want a book.
oh, good, come
Oh,
on.
yeah, I was going to say, yeah, at least
Oh,
one.
good, come on up, I'll sign it for no extra charge, okay?
So, thank you very much for coming out tonight and, please come again.
Thank you. Thank you.